Good morning. I'm Gary Lawler, Cedar Grove historian. This is the part one of 3 parts about the history of Cedar Grove. Just a short introduction on how we got here. In 2015, I was contacted by the Mennonite Historical Society. They were holding their annual meeting here at Cedar Grove in the Fellowship Hall, and they wanted to learn something about the church's history. Since I had recently become church historian, the task seemed to be mine. So on July 16, 2016, I gave a talk to the society, and Donna Zook told them about the unpaid ministers who served the congregation in its early years. After the speech, several persons, including Dave Grable, encouraged me to keep researching and compiling the church's story. This presentation wouldn't be possible except for the work done by Donna Zook, who was our first historian here at Cedar Grove. Donna spent countless hours assembling the material and the scrapbooks and cupboards in the historical center. It was her vision that preserved most of what we know about Cedar Grove and resulted in the center where it is preserved. Donna also wrote a booklet that is printed as part of the 75th anniversary celebration in 2005. There are many copies still available. Contact me if you would like to have one. I dedicate these lessons to her memory. Without her labors, a lot of our story would have been lost. Other persons deserve recognition. In 1935, Anna Stoner wrote a brief but valuable article for the Evangelical Visitor. Her sister, Mary Beth, spoke to the Juniata Mennonite Historical Society on the subject in 1996, and the Society kindly allowed me to copy her written speech. There are 2 histories that have been written about the larger history of the Brethren in Christ Church. The gray book on your left is an older one written about 1940 by A.W. Klimenhage. And the more modern one was written in the 1970s by Carlton Whitlinger. We really could use an updated history of the denomination. I think for the average reader, they should probably read Whitlinger, not only because he's more up to date, but because he's a little bit more analytical, where Klimenhage was more simply compiling facts and not really giving a more, shall we say, critical, analytical history of the church. Our story, to tell our story, we have to go back to Europe, to the beginnings of the Anabaptists. How did this movement spread from Zurich, Switzerland to Pennsylvania? You can see there in the middle of it, there's Zurich. The movement, the Anabaptist movement, was just one small part of the large movement called the Reformation that you read of today. But it began in Zurich, as I said. There were two key persons: Conrad Grebel, who was the lay leader of the believers. He died of the plague before the authorities caught up with him. And then Felix Mainz, who also for a few months led the early Anabaptist brethren. He was drowned in the Mat River in Zurich for his faith. During a trip we took to Europe in 1995, I was able to take this picture of the spot where Mainz was drowned. It was quite an impressive thing to stand there and be told the story and it was quite a memorable moment. Another key figure in the early Anabaptist movement was Michael Sattler. Sattler is thought to have been the main author of the 1527 Schleitheim Confession of Faith. It had about 7 different main tenets that were key to the Anabaptist movement. One was the literal obedience to Jesus' teachings. It was also the idea of the church as a covenant community, the idea of adult baptism, which went against both Catholic and mainline Protestant teaching at the time, separation from the evil world system, church discipline, non-violence, and refusing to swear oaths. Because of their refusal to bear arms and their rejection of infant baptism and a compulsory state church, the Anabaptists were persecuted by both the Catholics and other Protestant denominations. Some estimate as many as 2,500 persons, both women and men, were killed in the decades after the convention was adopted. During our trip, we were shown an authentic hiding place where Anabaptists actually hid when they were pursued by the authorities. This was an actual place where people actually would hide from their pursuers. One place in Europe that was tolerant of all different religion was the Netherlands. As a result, Holland and prospered during the 16 and 1700s because of the talent drain from some of these other places where the Anabaptists and other persecuted minorities went, and then their talents were used in Holland. But for our story, the Netherlands, and more specifically Amsterdam, down in a corner, were a jumping off place for Anabaptists who wanted to go to the New World and avoid the persecution in Europe. Another reason for their leaving was that between 1632, the start of the 30 Years' War, and 1763, there were at least 7 major wars fought in Europe. There you can see Amsterdam Harbor. That's a mock-up sailing ship. I'm not sure if that's what the ship would have looked like you would have traveled to the New World in, but many people became known as the Pennsylvania Germans. Probably about 80,000 over that period of time traveled to Pennsylvania, where William Penn had founded a colony with a policy of toleration toward all beliefs. As you can see there's Pennsylvania. Most of the immigrants, including some of my ancestors, would arrived in Philadelphia and then spread out over the state. Our particular group of our people that we're interested in ended up there. You can see Lancaster, in the Lancaster area. So that gets us to the beginnings of the Brethren in Christ Church. One key name you'll hear about in the founding of the Brethren in Christ was Jacob Engel. Jacob was born in Switzerland, and much like the Lawver family, apparently his family, the Engel family emigrated in the 1750s, and Jacob became part of a group that would become the Brethren in Christ. This group was apparently an independent group. They adopted many of the policies or practices of the Dunkers, also known as the Church of the Brethren, or the Mennonites. But no, they wanted to be immersed, and no particular pastor would agree to do that. So somewhere between 1775 and 1780, I think the general agreement now in the Brethren in Christ historians is that it was 1778. This group baptized each other, and that was the genesis of the Brethren in Christ. By about 1785, there was actually an organized Brethren in Christ church, and it's thought that they were the first completely independent of Europe denomination in the United States. In other words, by saying that, I'm saying that there was no church that they left in Europe that they had continued in the United States. So they were considered the first really homegrown church here. Shortly after that, came the 18th century confession, in which a group of brethren wrote down the tenets of the church. For many years, they were known as the River Brethren. That wasn't necessarily because they baptized in rivers, although sometimes they did, but simply because they were near the Susquehanna River. In the also, it's good to know that around that time, around 1800, a group emigrated to the Niagara Falls area of Ontario, Canada. Some of our BIC ancestors didn't feel comfortable living under the United States. They still felt loyalty to the British king, and so anyway, Jacob Engel actually traveled to Canada to meet with some of those immigrant brethren in 1789. Now, Jacob was not like, say, Martin Luther or, should we say, Menno Simons. He was not a theologian. He was more of an administrator. He was actually considered to be like the first bishop or overseer of the BIC denomination. Anyway, in their first century, the Brethren in Christ met in homes, a custom that was also existed in many Anabaptist traditions and still exists in the Amish. However, the BIC elected their church officials, and like the Mennonites who drew lots. During the 1850s, one group split from the denomination when their meeting house was disapproved. And so by the 1870s, the church had reversed their positions, and some congregations began meeting in or building their own church buildings. Each congregation had several unpaid ministers who took turns leading the services. They held their positions for life, or as long as they were physically able to fulfill their duties. Until the Civil War, they really thought of themselves as the Brethren, but during the Civil War, they were registered as the Brethren in Christ in Washington. They did register as an unresistant organization during the Civil War, and that's when they officially adopted the name of the Brethren in Christ Church. There's an odd footnote to that event. It seems that the bureaucrats who oversaw the filing of the papers lost them, and so we have no official record of it in the federal archives. The church was finally incorporated on May 2nd, 1904 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. speaking of the River Brethren, there's one other side note. If you ever read a biography of Dwight Eisenhower, you'll read that his grandmother belonged to the River Brethren, but actually she was a member of the Brother in Christ Church in Kansas. Church growth was slow. 100 years after the church starts, there were members in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Maryland, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Ontario, and Pennsylvania. There was a single household in Wisconsin. How they got there, I don't know. The church membership was 1,663 members from 718 households. The largest numbers at that time were in Ohio, Ontario, and Pennsylvania. And anyway, that brings us here. There you can see our roots, the three streams of our roots, the Anabaptist roots that we talked about, the Pietist groups like the Moravians, German groups, and John Wesley, and the holiness tradition that began in England. Anyway, this brings us to, as I said, to Juniata County. There were several different churches in the area that were founded right around this time. The Brethren in Christ were like the country as a whole, were moving west from Lancaster County and expanding to the west. But the information we have says that in 1835, the first group, or thereabouts, the first group began meeting. One of the ministers at that time was a man known as Jacob Kaufman. That's all the information I have on him. We don't know all that much about the first decades of the Brethren in Christ in Juniata County. We do know that as far as Juniata County itself had just been incorporated in 1830 or so, and life for the early Juniata County and Brethren in Christ would have been hard, and comforts would have been few. Their occupations would have revolved around the soil. In 1850, 58% of Americans worked in agriculture. Compare that to 1.5% in 2012. Anyway, our history of Cedar Grove proper began on June 20th, 1876, when David Moist and John Book bought Pike Meeting House for the local Brethren in Christ Church. This building, later called the Mount Pleasant Church, no longer exists. It was destroyed by a fire. The site of it is located here in Mount Pleasant along the William Penn Highway, where Pop's Antiques presently stands. Consider that the United States were only a few days shy of their 100th birthday when our story commenced, and that General Custer was on his way to the Little Bighorn to meet Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, a meeting that didn't go particularly well, especially for General Custer. So what were these early meetings like? I suspect we would be in for some rude jolts if we could time travel back there to the 1870s and 1880s. The congregation would have arrived in wagons. Clothing would have been plain. Women would have been dressed in gray with capes, shawls, and coverings. The building would have no electric lights or central heat, just a stove in the winter and no air conditioning in the summer. Women would have sat on one side and men on the other. The benches were not padded. Try the bench from the Pike Meeting House that sits up here in the upstairs narthex outside the sanctuary, and you'll find out what it would have felt like to spend a Sunday morning in the Pike Meeting House, at least how it would have felt to sit. There was no Sunday school for adults or children, no musical instruments were used, and you would have listened to a sermon or sermons in German. It wasn't until 1894 that our services changed from German to English. Anna Stoner wrote that sometimes bad weather would prevent the early Grovers from meeting for up to 8 weeks. It made me wonder, how did they postpone church without a phone system, or even today thinking of email? Did someone take the message from house to house in the same way the Amish do today? You're one of those puzzling little questions that inquiring minds want to know, but I haven't found much early information about the early decades. There was a little pamphlet was written for the book Family Reunion that stated that in 1898 a meeting was held in the old book home near the book cemetery in Boatman Mills. There was also a harvest meeting held at the home of Joe and Mattie Book in 1909. Joe and Mattie were an unmarried brother and sister. They were the children of Minister Abram Book. Their home was located along what is now Industrial Park Road near the entrance to Deerfield Road that comes down here to the church. There also was a barn love feast held on the Daniel Book homestead, which is still located across here at the church. It later became the farm of Daniel's son William, but there's no date for that. But it was certainly before my mother and my Aunt Mary were born, because neither of them had any memory of the event. Mary Beth Stoner listed the membership in 1892 at 21 persons. There are copies of the schedule there. There's from 1910 to 1912 indicate that they met every 2 weeks. And at that time they used the Pike Meeting House, the Cedar Grove Schoolhouse, and the Red Rock Schoolhouse as places to worship. 4 times a year they met with another BIC group that was up at McBaytown in Mifflin County. Anna Stoner listed several ministers who preached to the congregation on a rotating schedule. The names Jonathan Kaufman, David Moist, Abram Book, Jacob Shirk, Henry Yoder, Jacob Hostetler, John Smith, and Simeon Lawver were given. Some of these men might have been based elsewhere and visited the Uniata congregation. I don't know. There you can see some of the circumstances. This tombstone, although it wasn't located here in Juniata County, illustrates the uncertainty of life of the early Cedar Grovers in those pre-1900 days. There you see Sarah, the wife of Daniel Book, of Millersburg, who was born in 1861 and died in 1894. She didn't even make it to her 33rd birthday. The statistics are rather shocking. In 1900, every year you could expect that 1 out of 40 Americans would die annually. The life expectancy was 41 years. Compare that to 2013, that was pre-COVID, where only 1 out of 140 Americans would die annually, and the life expectancy was 79 years. Solomon's family even Lawver indicated that this uncertainty of life one of his sisters died only after a few days, and another sister died at 7 years old. Here's a picture of Emma Engel, my aunt. Emma's story also reflects the uncertainty of life. She kept a little book of, she would go into homes and care for, help out the mothers right after their children were born, take care of the children. She wasn't a midwife, but she kept account of a list of all of those children, and I was fortunate enough, one of her granddaughters loaned me that book, and she had 100. There were 110 children she listed, and I did a find a grave search just out of curiosity. Now I could not find nearly all of them, but of the ones I found, at least 9 of those 110 children died before adulthood, and 6 of those didn't even reach their second birthday. So that shows your how uncertain life was during those times. It was no wonder that people seemed to take life seriously, and the prospect of eternity was something to be seriously contemplated. There's Solomon Lawver and his wife Phoebe. That picture would have been taken before they joined a church. So there will be several more pictures here that you'll see of couples that were taken before they would have joined a church. The church tended to frown on photography, although I noticed that both our Book of Lawver families have quite a few pictures of the early times. So just exactly how serious that was taken, I'm not certain. There you can see Solomon's farm up above Van Wert. He was a farmer and a carpenter, a skilled carpenter. There's a pie cupboard in our home that he made for Phoebe a year after their marriage. Solomon preached till 1939. Apparently, poor health finally ended his around 45-year career as a minister. Around 1930, he and Phoebe left the farm and moved into the home where I and my brother live now. This was an aerial photo taken sometime in the 1940s, possibly. It's quite different. A lot of those trees there are gone now. The chicken houses that you see there on the left lower part of the property are long gone. After Solomon quit preaching, or possibly around that time, he began to develop dementia, and he would wander off and wander back to the farm that we saw in the previous slide, where he had lived for so many years. It's sort of a poignant fact. I remember one of his granddaughters told me that she was assigned to look after Grandpa and make sure that he didn't wander off whenever they were visiting. Another interesting part of his story was that the 1900 census stated that 14-year-old William Book was then living in the Solomon Lawver household. William's mother had died, and his father was unable to care for all their children. So William became a member, at least for some time, of Solomon's household. William would later become a deacon in the Cedar Grove congregation. This is a picture of he and my grandmother, Melissa. They were my maternal grandparents, with some of the other members of the family. Again, this would have probably been before they joined, shortly before they joined the church. You can see that they're dressed in what I guess would have been called secular clothing in those days. Here's a little interesting story. This is Melissa, again, probably before she Alyssa, she was a Hackenberger before she was married, and that's a picture of her. Here's a little story for the romantics among us. When she was 16, William gave her this watch. And before they were married, it was 4 or 5 years after that until they got married. And that watch has been passed down through the family. And at our recent book reunion, it was exhibited by the granddaughter, the great-granddaughter who now has it. You can see the watch there. Quite a gift from a young man who was only about 16 himself to his girlfriend. He must have saved up quite for it. Anyway, it gives us an idea that our ancestors were more romantic perhaps than we might have credited them with being. Okay, in 1915, after quite a few years, things seems to be beginning to happen. It seemed like in 1915, the first revival in the area was held, and that seemed to have triggered a sort of should we say, increased church activity. And then the same year, midweek prayer meetings began. They would have been held in homes. And in the next year, the first congregational council was held. And in 1920, the congregation began to hold Sunday school. They started out for 6 months, then it was expanded to 9 months, and finally, around the time that the church was built, it became year-round. It was rather a hot potato for a while. Many people were not in favor of Sunday school, and so it was William Book, who was one of the founders, that found it. He was a deacon. After a year, he resigned his position as co-Sunday school superintendent. But it eventually became accepted as part of the church program. Building a church. What triggered the building of the church was after many years, the church was unable to get a clear title to the Pike Meeting House. And so Bishop Henry Huffer encouraged this congregation to build a church of its own. Bishop Huffer must have been quite a character. My dad knew him. My dad actually, as a young man, drove the bishop around when he visited the area. And my dad told the story that Bishop Huffer, who had been twice widowed, proposed to his third wife by asking her if she'd like to be buried alongside the other two. Apparently she wanted to be, so somewhere there's a cemetery with Bishop Huffer and a row of wives. Anyway, we look at that and see the fact the building fund begins with $5. But you have to remember what $5 was worth in 1928. My dad, who began working shortly after that, was only getting like $1.25 a day. So for someone who contributed $5 was actually a rather large sum of money at that time. Anyway, by January 1930, they had a meeting at the Stewart Leiter home, and it was decided that they would. They formed Harvey Lawler and John Stoner were the fundraisers for the building program, and my grandfather William Book and two brothers, Charles and Greeley Gingrich, were the building committee appointed to find the location. And like much later, it didn't take much time to get the whole thing going. In February 1930, they had a council that decided to build on land that was donated by Greeley Gingrich. The building cost $4,817.40, or about $78,000 in today's money. It was dedicated on October 19th, 1930. It took until 1936 to wire the building for electricity. Probably was one of the WPA projects that were ongoing during that time. There you can see Greeley Gingrich and his wife Jenny. Jenny would live until, I believe, 1978 or 1979. She almost lived to be 99. Greeley and his brother Charlie were noted barn builders, and they were the builders of the church. There you can see a photo of the actual church as it was being built. You can see that it was in progress there. You can see the rafters being put up. Since the William Book family lived right across the road, or lived what is now across the highway, there was probably no road there then. They every evening, my grandmother would bring her young daughters over to see the progress that was being made. There are the young daughters. The smallest one there would have been my Aunt Jane. The girl on the left was my mother, Viola, and there in the middle would have been my Aunt Mary, and behind is my Aunt Esther, who was a bit older, and the dog. Don't know the dog's name, not sure on him. But anyway, by the 1931 council report included that after the building was done, there was a balance of $72.71. The building included a basement that would be used for the Love Feast meals. A notice was placed in the October 6th, 1930 Evangelical Visitor. The brothers and sisters of Juniata and Mifflin County District have decided to have a new church dedicated on October 19th. Lord willing. The dedication service will be in the forenoon, immediately following the noon lunch. The Sunday school lesson will be discussed, followed by a topic on church doctrine to discuss by several brothers. Anyway, the church was dedicated debt-free on October 19th, 1930. The temperature that day were somewhere in the mid-40s to low 50s. Ella Lawver, the visitor correspondent, wrote, owing to the fair weather, a large company of brothers and sisters gathered from the surrounding districts, and the day was spent in worship and praise to God. The church not being so large, the main part was soon filled, and then the basement was used as a chapel, and services were held there throughout the day. It is surely with a sense of unworthiness that we meditate upon what has been made possible for us through the help of our brothers and sisters from many places who assisted in a financial way. Anyway, they held communion in a new building on November 22nd, and they planned they held a 2-week series of meetings beginning on December the 7th. You can consider the excitement as the members would gather nightly in their newly dedicated church. Visualize them sitting there, listening to the speaker under the glow of the kerosene lights. There's the church, a picture of the church. Philip Varner tells me that actually was taken later, that was a youth meeting that was held at the church during the 1950s, but it does illustrate what the first church looked like. There is a kerosene lamp, although not one of the ones at the church. You can see on the wall here above the fellowship hall going up to the narthex, there's one mounted on the wall. You can see one of the original kerosene lamps. Again, there were unpaid ministers who pastored the congregation in 3 or 4 of them at a time. There was William Longenecker and his wife Annie, who, again, that would have been a picture taken probably before they joined the church, probably a wedding picture. There is another minister. This was Charlie Heaster. Charlie was a railroad man, and so Charlie could travel free on the railroad, and he didn't live right here in Juniata County. He would travel from his home on Saturday, and my grandfather, William Book, would pick him up at the station here somewhere in Mexico, and he would stay at the Book farm while he held over Sunday, while he preached. There's Harvey Lawver. Harvey succeeded his father Solomon in 1939 when Solomon stepped down from the ministry. There is his numerous family. And then you can see there his next to him was his wife Ruth. They farmed the Solomon Lawver farm after Solomon moved down, and his wife Phoebe moved down to Van Wert. You might have thought that Juniata Countyans and early brethren in Christ would have lived much as we do today. They would have not had computers and cell phones. But there's a dark reality going on during the Depression. In 1930, only 1 out of 10 farms would have had electricity. By 1940, even after a decade after the Depression began, there was 17% unemployment, 31% of dwellings had no running water, 58% had no central heating, 39% have houses had no shower or tub. Only 2 in 5 persons had progressed beyond the 8th grade, and only 1 in 4 people had graduated from high school, and only 1 out of 20 persons was a college graduate. This was true, some of this was true in my own family. The Lawver home there in Van Wert that you saw earlier had no central heating till we moved there in 1963, and a furnace was installed. And the Book family, this is in their home in Thompsontown, they had no indoor plumbing till they moved there in 1942. What would the church activities have been like? Well, there was prayer meeting in the middle of the week, but then there were some special events that would happen. There would have been love feast and harvest meetings. The love feast was held in the spring, and then the harvest meeting would have been held in the fall. They were much the same. There would have been see here. Excuse me a moment. They would have had services on Saturday afternoon after everybody traveled there. Many people, often a love feast was held among several different congregations. They would have been services Saturday afternoon, morning and afternoons with communion and feet washing service in the evening. And then there would be noon and evening meals that were served on the premises. Often this would be at a home instead of the church. Although often the men would sleep in the barn and the women in the house. The next morning there would be breakfast, a morning service, and a noon meal, and then goodbyes for the people from out of the area, and then they would head for home. It was both a spiritual and a social event. Mary Beth's parents, Mary Beth Stoner's parents, John Stoner and Martha Book, met at a McVaytown love feast. Martha was from Juniata County. She was a sister of William Book, and John was from Blair County. Sometimes there were also, of course, revival meetings 2 or 3 times a year, and there would, of course, be baptisms after the revival meetings for those who were converted, sometimes even in the winter. The first baptisms were held right down here in the creek below the church, sometimes on the William Book property. The love feast sermons, apparently some of the younger people apparently got bored with all the preaching. There you can see a little notebook that was kept by the Lawver, someone in the Lawver family. There on the left is a list of love feasts. There on the other page, where they kept an account for several years detailed account of the meetings, the times of even what the texts that were preached from. It was quite an interesting book. A cousin of mine sent me emailed me pictures of the pages, and I was able to help to reconstruct some of the history using that book. There is a back in the 1970s, our youth group held sort of a reenactment of what a barn meeting at a love feast would have been like. There you can see, and although it's kind of, they tried to dress in vintage garb, whether it actually looked quite like that or not, I'm really not sure, but at least it gives you a little bit of an idea. This picture, as I said, some of the young people apparently did get bored with all the preaching. There's a picture of my dad with his favorite rabbit dog, Ted. The story came down from my Uncle Roy Book that he, my father, and my Uncle Sam, one afternoon during a love feast, went out and ran some rabbits. I don't know whether Ted was in on that particular rabbit running or not. This picture is another family picture of mine, but I put it in not just because it's my family, but because it illustrated a larger problem that was happening during these early years in the 1930s and 1940s. There you can see Harvey Lawler, who was the minister, my Uncle Sam, who was one of the rabbit hunters, and my dad. What's notable about that picture, why I put it in there, Harvey stayed a minister in the congregation, but Uncle Sam and Dad both left and joined other churches, although they would occasionally return to the church, and my dad was involved in some of the building programs. They left the church, and many families went through this, and many of the young people left the church, and because there just wasn't programs for them, or they didn't feel a connection to the church. And that'll be something we'll talk about next week. There's the evangelical visitor. The visitor was sort of the early church internet, so to speak. It was begun in the 1890s. It was quite a controversial item for a while. It only survived one conference. They almost voted it down. It only survived by about having its funding cut by about 9 votes. Apparently the controversy started whenever the editor put a typewriter ad for typewriters in the Visitor to raise money, and that was quite controversial. They almost shut it down. There you can see the layout of the ministers. There was church news. There you can see births, weddings. Of course, there was also obituaries, and then there would be articles about issues within the church. This is my Aunt Ella Lawler. She was our correspondent for many years to the Visitor. Aunt Ella had quite a few Donna's preserved some of the items that she put into the Visitor. One that I found particularly interesting was sometime around 1930, she mentioned a love feast meeting during which an elderly brother and sister from another area gave their testimonies in German. What was interesting about that was by that time, most people in the BIC were using English as their primary language, but apparently these two older members still felt more comfortable conversing in Pennsylvania German. Aunt Ella, this is the only picture that we really have of Aunt Ella. She was one of the old-time members who didn't believe in having her picture taken. And so that's the only picture we have of her. There were revival meetings, often tent meetings. Tent meetings, the denomination owned a tent, and it would be put up in different areas of the county. My mother traced her salvation to a tent meeting that was held in 1939 up above Van Wert at the intersection of Moore Road and above Van Wert. This picture is of the Hindball picnic grounds on the Pinnacle Road, along Pinnacle Road north of Locust Run. That was another area, not quite in that location, but in that particular spot that in the picnic grounds there was a tent set up and meetings were held there. I can remember tent meetings when I was a boy in the 1960s, sitting in the old, by then somewhat moth-eaten tent, looking up at the ceiling at the yellow lights and the holes in the top of the tent, and the final meeting was held here at the church in 1980. It was sponsored by the Young Married class, and the tent was set up here where the ball field is now. There have been about 150 revival meetings since that first revival meeting in 1915. We have most of them listed. There were a couple years where Donna was away and nobody, they're probably in the church records that I haven't looked into yet, but we have almost all of them listed. Another event in the Brethren in Christ year was, at least in Pennsylvania, was Roxbury. Roxbury Holiness Camp began in 1933 in a converted dance hall in Franklin County. And in 1941, the camp bought the hall and the surrounding land. The August meetings, of course, became a yearly highlight among our members. Some built or purchased cabins on the camp grounds or placed